All right, so we're now into the third week of the semester, and this week we take up a discussion of the economic context of social welfare policy. And so when I say economic context, I'm not referring to an in-depth discussion about economics per se here in this lecture, but more so the objective of this lecture is to help us attain a better understanding of the different ways in which governments manage and operate their finances. And so this lecture really could be called the fiscal context of social welfare policy. That's really the primary focus of this lecture. And so this is just a quick outline of what I intend to cover. In this lecture, we'll start out with a quick background discussion. This is largely coming from your Dolgoff reading. And so there's some key terms and their definitions that are outlined in that reading. So we'll start, that's our starting point in this lecture. And then we'll get to the focus for this lecture. That's around fiscal policy. And so what we mean by fiscal policy is we're referring to government's taxing and spending authority. That is, the different ways in which governments generate revenue on the one hand and the different ways in which governments spend that revenue is what we mean there. And then we'll take a step back and we'll take sort of a bird's eye view of fiscal policy and think about, we'll consider two philosophical approaches or historical traditions about how government might best set his fiscal and monetary policy so as to maximize the health of our economy. And so we'll consider Keynesian philosophy and also supply side theory, and that'll wrap up the first part of this lecture. And then the second part of this lecture, we're going to build up towards an understanding of the earned income tax credit. Now this is the second largest anti-poverty policy that's currently in place, and so that's just to stress the importance of this policy for our purposes. And so that'll be the focal point for the second part of this lecture. All right, but first, we'll start with some key terms. And so Professor Dolgoff notes a definition of economics. He says that economics is a study of income, production, and the distribution of goods and services. So that, for those of you who've taken economics before, you may have noticed that that sounds very much like the topics that are covered in your microeconomics classes. That is, you'll probably study consumer behavior in the first part of your microeconomics course. You'll study production, or the behavior of firms and organizations in the second part of your microeconomics classes. And then you'll probably study welfare economics, right, or distributive justice. That is, how do we maximize societal welfare? So we have a different unit of analysis there. We're trying to maximize societal welfare as opposed to individual actors or firms or organizations. And so what I'm getting at here is that really that we're talking about a definition of microeconomics, not so much economics more generally, but Professor Dolgoff goes a little bit broader in the second part of his definition. He says that economics is a study of social systems. So certainly that's a bit broader in the way that he's defining economics. And then he talks about allocating scarce resources. And so taken together, these two statements taken together, I would just add that given the different actors, right? Individuals, firms, organizations, society at large, we have different actors at different levels, and they have different competing interests or wants. So whether it's maximizing utility at the individual level or profits at the firm or organization level, we have all these competing wants, and so economics is really the study of how we allocate scarce resources. Given the scarcity of resources, how do we best allocate those resources so as to satisfy all those competing wants? Okay? And so that would offer so I would offer that as an integration of these two subparts of the definition. And so that, of course, begs the question, well, why do we care about economics in your policy class? Well, I would just note that policy discussions are often dominated by economists. So economists are largely, they dominate the policy literature, and so it's important for our purposes to understand, at least on a basic level, the language that's used by economists so as to better understand the social policies. Right? So we study economics in both your intro course and in your advanced policy course in this program. And so getting back on track here, Professor Dolgoff notes a couple of major concerns of economists, right, when they consider policies. And so rephrasing that a little bit differently. So if we're thinking about policies and how to assess the desirability of social welfare policies, two of the criteria that are used, I'm just using different language, not so much concerns, but criteria, are around issues of efficiency and also of equity. So we've talked about equity before in your first lecture, but that's what Professor Dolgoff is getting at here. So these are criteria that we use to assess the desirability of policies. And of course, economists measure these outcomes or these criteria in different ways maybe along the lines of GDP or gross domestic product to measure economic growth. And then there's, of course, something called the Gini coefficient that's often used to measure the level of inequality in a given society. That's, in turn, a measure of equity. Okay, and so to the larger point that these are some major criteria that we use to assess policies. All right, so given our definitions of economics and some of the major criteria used to assess social welfare policies, we're just characterizing different economies here. So given our definitions, how do we characterize the different nation states and their social systems that they put together? Well, we want to think about some fundamental concerns of all the different social systems. Right? There might be issues concerned with decisions around what to produce in a given economy, right? And there might be decisions around for whom to produce goods and services, and of course how to produce those goods and services. So there are some fundamental questions in any given economy that must be answered. And so where we allow private entities, right, private entities to answer those questions or to decide those questions, those economies are mostly characterized as capitalistic in nature. Right? They're capitalist economies where we have private individuals or private entities answering those basic fundamental economic questions, and where we have some central authority, namely some government, deciding those questions of what to produce and for whom to produce and how to produce. We would characterize that as being more of socialist in nature, where we have government making those decisions. And so Professor Dolgoff in the reading just makes the note that most economies are somewhere in between. So most, as a practical matter, most nation states are mixed economies. That is, we have elements of both capitalistic decision-making, also of socialistic, more socialistic in nature. I would just note that that you really have to look at a given industry or a particular market to characterize an economy as being capitalistic or socialistic in nature. That is, for example, take the healthcare industry, for example. Right? If you were to assess the level of spending, all the spending that's being done in the healthcare industry, and assess the percentage of spending that's being done by private entities, you would have a measure of the extent to which you might characterize that industry as being capitalistic in nature. And so my point here is just about making sure that you're looking at a particular industry when assessing whether that particular economy is in fact capitalistic or socialistic in nature. All right. So to the main focus of this first part of the lecture, and so we're talking about fiscal policy, to which I refer to as the government's spending and taxing authority on the two sides. And so there's some more terminology here that Professor Dolgoff is introducing to us. And so he notes the case of budget surpluses and budget deficits and balancing of budgets. And so whether we're talking about government at the federal level or the state level or the local level, you might have a scenario in which the amount of revenue being generated by a particular governmental unit exceeds the amount of spending being done. So we label that as being a government surplus, right, or a budget surplus in that case. And then where the amount of revenue being generated is not comparable to the amount of spending being done by the government unit, we characterize that as being a deficit, a budget deficit. And of course, where those two sides approximate one another, the level of spending and the amount of revenues being generated, we call that balancing a budget. Okay, and so we have some further terminology here. And of course, we'll note the different ways in which governments generate revenue and also spend that revenue. And so the basic point here in the first section was about how governments may not always just rely solely on taxation to generate revenue. So there might be some borrowing involved. And one of the examples that Professor Dolgoff notes is in the way of city governments and their issuance of municipal bonds. So there might be, what we mean by municipal bonds, we have certain promissory notes, essentially certain documents that local governments will issue to individuals, basically promising to repay with interest, right? That's what we have, that's what we mean by a municipal bond, essentially. And so just to point out that that's one alternative way in which governments might generate revenue. And then, of course, we can think about all the different ways in which governments will spend that revenue. And so you can think about all the different social welfare programs, all the investment in infrastructure, energy, what have you, right? All the different ways in which governments will spend that revenue is what we're noting here, right? All right, so let's go back to the revenue generating side and taxation as one form of generating revenue And we're noting three different types of taxes here, progressive taxes, regressive taxes, and proportional taxes. I would note that the larger issue that we're grappling with here in the way of characterizing a tax as being progressive or regressive in nature is thinking about the relative burden of a tax on a lower income worker versus a higher income worker, right? So if you have a tax that's assessed and it's relatively burdensome to the lower income worker, we would consider that to be regressive in nature. If it's more burdensome to the higher income worker, we would consider that to be more progressive in nature. And more technically speaking, we'll go through the examples here, but where you're increasing income levels, right? You're moving from the low income worker to the high income worker. So as you increase income levels, where the rate of tax increases, that's characterized as a progressive tax. And so our federal income tax structure is one example of a graduated or progressive tax that is low income workers at the lowest level. We tax, the marginal tax rate is at 10%. Excuse me, the highest highest earners, the highest income workers are taxed at close to 40%. So you can see how that's graduated, or that's progressive in nature. And then we have a regressive tax. So once again, as you move from lower income levels to higher income levels, you look at the rate of tax and you say, well, if the rate of tax is declining or decreasing, then we have a regressive tax, more technically speaking. And so Dolgoff notes a couple of examples of regressive taxes, most notably in the way of sales taxes and gasoline taxes. Now, when I was an undergrad and I was introduced to these ideas, this idea that a sales tax or gasoline tax is regressive in nature, I didn't buy it. I didn't buy it initially because you think, well, a sales tax, right, in Chicago, for example, 9.25% tax, doesn't matter what your level of income is, everyone seems to be paying the same rate of tax. But here's where you have to think a little further. So let me give you an example. Let's say I go to a Nordstrom rack, right? I'm not going to go to Nordstrom. I want to avoid the high prices. I go to Nordstrom rack. I look at a shirt that I want to buy, and that shirt is $30. So let's round up to 10%, right? The sales tax for ease of calculation. Let's say we have a 10% tax, so I'm going to end up paying $3 in the way of a sales tax. And so let's say we have another worker. Let's say Donald Trump. I don't know why Donald Trump would want to go to Nordstrom Rack, but let's say, hypothetically, he goes to Nordstrom Rack, and he wants that same shirt, $30. The tax for him also would be $3, assuming a 10% sales tax. And you think that the amount of tax is the same, but we say that it's regressive in nature because we have to assess that $3 tax as a percentage of my income and versus a percentage of the Donald's income. It's a much higher percentage of my income than the Donald's income, and so it hits me. It's more burdensome to me as the lower income worker here in this scenario, right? And so we characterize that as being regressive in nature. And perhaps more intuitive is a gasoline tax, or let's just think about gasoline prices in general. The next time gas prices hike up to beyond $4, ask yourself, is that more burdensome to lower income worker versus a higher income worker? And certainly, I think you would conclude that the lower income worker is burdened disproportionately, and therefore we characterize those taxes as being regressive in nature. All right, and then finally, we have proportional or flat tax. So in the case of a proportional tax, as you increase income levels from the low income worker to the high income worker, the rate of tax is staying the same. Okay? And so the Dolgoff reading will note that the Medicare tax is the proportional tax. So that used to be the case, but with the Affordable Care Act, so higher income workers pay almost a 1%. There's a 1% increase for individuals earning more than $250,000. And so it's actually progressive in nature now, but I just note a different example here, the state income tax, right? So apart from the federal income tax that we characterize as being progressive in nature, the state income tax, we pay 3.75%, and that doesn't matter what level your income is. So we have the case of proportional tax when we talk about the Illinois state income tax. All right, so these are examples from the Dolgoff reading. You'll note that you have, just to reiterate this point, you have three different workers with three different income levels, $10,000, $50,000, the $100,000 worker, three different workers. And you have three different types of taxes in three different columns or sets of columns here. You'll note that in this first column, or this first set of columns, that everyone seems to be paying the same amount of tax, right? The $10,000 worker, $50,000 worker, the $100,000 worker, everyone is paying $1,000. But notice that the rate, right, though that $1,000 assessed as a percentage of each person's income, annual income, these are the resulting percentages, 10%, 2%, 1%. And so we need to focus on the rates, the proportions here. And so we notice that that's in fact declining from 10% to 1%. So we'll characterize that as being regressive in nature. Look at the second column here, second sets of columns. And so you'll notice the amounts are increasing with income levels, but you'll notice that the percentages, the rates of the tax are also increasing from 15% all the way to 40%. And so you'll notice that this is in fact an example of a progressive tax in the way that it's increasing. And then finally, you'll notice that the amounts are once again increasing, but important for our purposes, we have to look at the rates. And you'll notice that the rates are the same across the different income levels. And so this is our example of a flat or proportional tax. All right, so as I said, we want to take a step back for a second. Aside from the mechanics of fiscal policy, we want to think about the significance of fiscal policy and why that might be important. And so the ways in which our government sets fiscal policy can have an impact on the health of the overall economy, not just fiscal policy, but different policies as well, monetary policy, right? So different ways in which we control money supply and such will have an impact on things like unemployment, right? On the overall health of the economy, unemployment, inflation, growth, whether or not we're seeing growth in our economy as a whole by looking at GDP. And so, so we consider here two different philosophical traditions for how we set our fiscal policy so as to maximize the health of our economy. One is rooted in Keynesian thinking, and that's pronounced Keynes, after the British economist John Maynard Keynes. So it's not Keynes, but Keynes. So we have Keynesian philosophy about how to stabilize or stimulate our economy, especially during times of economic crisis. And then we have supply side theory. On the other hand, they have a different notion about how to best stabilize or stimulate the economy or maintaining the health of the economy. And so first we'll note Keynesianism. So first, Keynesianism is really born out of the New Deal history or the philosophy that we talked about before. So you'll recall that that FDR had a particular philosophy in place to address or to respond to the economic challenges during the Great Depression era. And so this was not an era characterized by laissez-faire thinking. It's not that the federal government just took a step back and let the invisible hand of the market work itself out, that booms and busts just happened to occur in capitalistic societies. There was massive federal government intervention in the way of public works projects. That is, the federal government created federal government jobs so as to stimulate demand. That is, it was thought that with greater government involvement, that you would be creating jobs, and so that would put more money into the pockets of everyday citizens to be able to spend, and that would stimulate the demand in our economy. And so that reflects Keynesian thinking. Right? This is really a historical argument that during times of economic crisis, that really the role of the federal government should be one of greater government intervention as opposed to just as a passive role for the federal government. And so you may note that President Obama, in response to the Great Recession, sort of took a similar approach in passing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This was a stimulus package that injected upwards of $800 billion into the economy. And so that's certainly, looking at FDR, I think he was taking a historical lesson. So that's reflective of Keynesian economics, that government should take an active role in addressing the health of the economy. And then you have supply side theory. The arguments here are a little more nuanced than what we have in the way of Keynesian thinking, but the basic tool, according to supply side theorists, in the way of stimulating or stabilizing our economy, is that we should be implementing tax cuts. Right? The major tool that supply side theorists argue would best promote growth in our economy is through tax cuts. Right? And there's an intricate sort of web of arguments here, according to supply side theorists, but the basic idea, right, aside from the technicalities, is that if you were to cut taxes, that people would be incentivized to work harder, right? So you can think through the logic. So if the government cuts taxes, let's say income taxes, you're going to have more money to spend, and so you're going to be incentivized by that government behavior. So you're going to work harder, and so employment should increase, right? If employment on the aggregate level increases, then as a whole, what you'll end up seeing is that in the short run, you're certainly going to generate less government revenue by cutting taxes, but the argument, the ultimate argument, according to supply-side theories, is that when you cut taxes, in the long run, that you'd actually increase government revenue because people work more, and it's through increased employment that income levels rise, and therefore tax revenue should also rise. And so the Reagan administration, this is born out of the Reagan administration, their economic policies during the 1980s, in which they cut taxes, and the argument was that you would generate more government revenue, you could maintain the same level of spending, because in the long run that you would realize greater employment and greater government revenue. And so the Reagan administration will point out that they actually did in fact increase revenues, but of course you have Keynesian theorists who come in and say, well, you have to look at the type of tax. So it's true that the Reagan administration did in fact cut income taxes, but they also increased payroll taxes, which might explain why government revenue actually increased as a result of the tax cuts. But the major point here is that there's evidence both ways, especially if you look at the Bush administration. Of course, immediately after the Bush tax cuts, which were successive from 2000, 2005, 2006, certainly there was less government revenue being generated in the short term, but there was actually a greater government revenue in the long term. And so there's evidence really supporting both sides here. Okay? And so what we want to take away is that there's basically two general philosophical approaches about how to best stimulate our economy. One that's centered on greater government intervention, right? And the other that's centered on tax cuts as the main tool to achieve economic growth. Okay? And so in the next part of this lecture, we'll consider how taxes might impact vulnerable populations, and so we'll get into a discussion about the earned income tax credit.